I felt the first tremor in the pit of my stomach before I ever switched on my recording equipment. That faint, pulsing sensation coursed through me like a warning I didn't yet understand. The air in my apartment crackled with an odd tension, as though an unseen hand hovered just above my shoulders. Even the walls seemed to hum at a frequency I couldn't quite place. At the time, I brushed it off as nerves. After all, I was about to embark on a project unlike anything I had ever attempted. Little did I know that the static in the air was just the beginning of something far darker. I specialize in capturing the sounds most people never notice. Quiet hums in abandoned factories, whispering echoes in deserted hallways, the sub-bass frequencies that vibrate through empty rooms. I'd been commissioned to produce a documentary on low-frequency noises, phenomena often attributed to structural quirks or environmental anomalies. I believed I was simply collecting data, but I soon discovered I was luring something toward me, something that thrives in the hidden spaces between sounds. The first location I visited was an old chemical plant on the outskirts of the city. The facility had been shut down for years, its massive silos rusted and graffiti scarred. When I stepped inside, the silence was overpowering. My chest felt tight, as if the building itself squeezed the breath from my lungs. I set up my recorder in a chamber that had once housed heavy machinery. The acoustics were uncanny. Every footstep echoed strangely, almost as if the walls swallowed the reverberations. As I began to record, I sensed an undercurrent below the drone of the wind rattling the decrepit ceiling. It sounded like a heartbeat, low, rhythmic, and so faint I could barely detect it with my naked ear. Yet, when I listened through the headphones later, it was undeniably there, a pulsing throb, steady and haunting. I moved on to other abandoned spots, shuttered schools, boarded-up theaters, and a derelict prison block. Every single place had that same subterranean tempo beneath the ambient noise. Sometimes I'd pick up what resembled hushed voices, but they were too distorted to make out actual words. My nights grew restless. I'd jolt awake, gasping for air, my heart hammering. Whenever I closed my eyes, I dreamed of a shape formed by vibrating waves, a grotesque figure that flickered between solidity and intangible distortion. Back in my home studio, I isolated those low frequencies and played them through my monitors. Instantly, the lights began to flicker, and an intense pressure seemed to build inside my head. My desk lamp vibrated just enough to send a tingling shock through my fingertips whenever I touched it. The room itself felt alive, pulsing in time with the audio. I could practically taste the metallic tang of electricity on my tongue, which made me nauseated and anxious. I remember visiting a sound engineer friend of mine who had expressed concern about my obsession with these frequencies. He noted I looked pale, sweaty, and jumpy. I only offered a vague explanation, telling him I was exhausted from editing. He suggested I take a break. That night I went home and listened to the recordings again, ignoring his advice. The flickering lights grew more erratic, and the walls themselves seemed to hum. My breathing became ragged, my palms clammy. A faint swishing noise trickled through the headphones, almost like whispering breath against my ear. The moment I shut off the audio, the flickering stopped. But the pressure in my chest refused to subside. Each night thereafter, I had the same nightmare. I stood in a pitch-black corridor, the only light coming from a faint red glow at the end of the hallway. That disformed, pulsing creature stood before me, its body composed of wavering lines and jagged edges. It let out a low, resonant moan, each wave of sound pressing against my ribcage until I felt my heartbeat slow to match its rhythm. I'd wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. My sheets would be clammy, and the room would smell stale, like damp concrete and old metal. A few days later, I decided to examine my recordings in a more controlled environment. I rented a small, windowless studio downtown. It was designed for perfect acoustics, with soundproof foam on every wall. I uploaded my files and looped that disconcerting heartbeat-like throb for analysis. As it played, the overhead lights flickered again, even more violently than before. Every hair on my body stood on end. My ears popped, as though the pressure in the room had tripled. My laptop screen glitched, static tearing across the screen, and the waveform software displayed spikes so high they seemed impossible. I called the building's manager and asked if there were any electrical problems. In a curt tone, he said everything had always functioned smoothly. I sensed he was hiding his unease, but I refused to consider that I might be stirring something best left silent. My own denial blinded me to the possibility that this was more than mere interference. One particularly restless night, I woke with a jolt and realized my nose was bleeding. My head pounded. The taste of iron filled my mouth, and my hands trembled so violently I could barely steady myself against the wall. When I flicked on the light, I saw 5 perfect circles etched into the concrete floor of my studio. They overlapped like interlocking rings, each about a foot in diameter. The sight made my stomach twist. I had not left anything on the floor that could cause such markings, and they certainly hadn't been there before. My throat went dry, and I felt the quickening cadence of my heart as I approached the circles. I thought I could hear something faint within them, a soft, rhythmic tapping that grew louder the closer I leaned in. The air inside those rings felt warmer, charged. I stumbled back, goosebumps racing across my arms. It was as if the sound waves I had captured were allowing something to cross into my world. My mind spun with the horrifying possibility that I had inadvertently opened a gateway. Despite my trembling legs, I forced myself to shut down my equipment. I stored the recordings on an external drive, locked it in a case, and swore to never play them again. Even so, I can still hear it sometimes, in moments of silence. That persistent throb, matching my own pulse. It's like the echo of a half-formed entity waiting to fully manifest. I've sealed the drive away, but I know it's not enough. Something from those abandoned buildings followed me home, embedded in the frequencies I obsessed over. Now, I keep every light on whenever I sleep. I sense the presence still, lurking just beyond the edge of hearing. The circular marks remain on my studio floor, a silent reminder of how fragile the boundaries between worlds can be. I escape the darkness physically, but I feel it clinging to me in every quiet moment. Sometimes, late at night, I reach for my headphones and then stop myself, heart thudding in my chest, because I can't shake the fear that if I ever listen again, that formless creature will finally take shape, and I'm not sure I'd be able to shut it out a second time. In the hush of that late hour, my building seemed to hold its breath. The worn walls and flickering overhead lights hinted at something brooding just out of sight. A chill seeped through the hallways, as though old secrets stirred in the shadows. Standing there, I could almost feel the building's ancient bones shifting beneath my feet, reminding me that some places were not meant to be disturbed. I remember returning from work that night, feeling heavy and exhausted. My fingers were stiff from the evening cold, and each step echoed in the deserted foyer. The marble floor beneath my shoes felt colder than usual, as if the building had lost all warmth. My heart pounded with an unexplainable unease, Maybe it was the echo of my own footsteps ricocheting down the corridor, or perhaps the faint hum in the silence that suggested someone or something was listening. Normally, I would never give these corridors a second thought, but that night, every detail seemed amplified, as if an invisible presence was urging me to stay alert. I approached the elevator the same way I had done countless times before. The overhead light flickered, revealing the out-of-order sign, still taped unevenly across the door. Everyone in the building was aware that the elevator had been without power for several days. The superintendent had told us repeatedly that no one should even touch it, much less expect it to work. Yet there it stood, its dark metal doors open, the inside lights strangely illuminated. I caught myself mid-breath, every muscle in my body tensing in protest. A week earlier, the building manager, Mr. Oliveira, had passed away. The official notice had been posted near the mailboxes, and I had even attended a brief memorial in the lobby. Still, I found myself face to face with the impossible. Inside the elevator stood a familiar figure, identical to Mr. Oliveira, beckoning me to enter as if nothing had happened. My throat constricted, and I felt my pulse hammering against my temples. It took everything in me just to blink, to verify I wasn't hallucinating. I tried to whisper to myself that this couldn't be real. People had spoken in hushed voices about sightings, odd shapes drifting through the corridors, late-night whispers echoing where no one stood. But I always dismissed those tales as nervous chatter. Yet there he was, or some presence wearing his face. My breath caught in my chest. My mind screamed for me to look away, to run, but my legs refused to obey. I could feel cold sweat trickle down my neck, and my lungs tightened as the sound of my heartbeat grew louder than the buzzing overhead light. My eyes stung with tears of confusion. The figure stared at me, with a half-smile that felt wrong, as though the face had remembered how to smile but forgot what it meant. He raised a hand, gesturing in slow, deliberate motions for me to step inside. I was rooted to the spot. My hands trembled at my sides, and a faint hiss rang in my ears, as though the building itself was whispering a warning. When the elevator doors began to close, I instinctively jerked forward, wanting to protest, to halt whatever was about to happen. But my body froze again, stuck between the urge to flee and the terrifying pull of curiosity. The doors slid shut with a silent whoosh, sealing away the unearthly figure. In the silence that followed, my breathing sounded like thunder to my own ears. Then, despite having no one inside pressing any buttons, at least no one I could see, the elevator's indicator lights started to climb. Second floor, third, fourth, all the way up to 10. A security camera hung in the corner of the lobby, its lens aimed squarely at the elevator. I recalled how it had captured only me standing there, staring at something invisible. No one would ever believe my version of events. They would say the camera told the truth, that I was just standing alone in front of a broken elevator. But I knew what I had seen, and the memory of that out-of-place glow inside the car refused to let me rest. My knees felt weak as I ventured toward the stairwell. I had no desire to climb 10 flights of old, poorly lit steps, but a dreadful urgency compelled me to find out what was happening. Each step up took monumental effort. My breaths became ragged, sweat gathering on my forehead, and my body protested every movement. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed louder than usual, some flickering out the moment I approached. At times, the entire stairwell would plunge into darkness, forcing me to cling to the railing until my eyes adjusted. As I climbed, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain that any second I would glimpse a fleeting shadow or an outline of someone behind me. I thought I heard faint shuffling sounds, like feet dragging against the concrete steps. Once, I paused, placing my palm flat against the wall, hoping the solid surface would anchor me to reality. My heart pounded so hard that I felt it might burst from my chest. The dryness in my mouth grew unbearable. I swallowed repeatedly, trying to generate saliva, but every attempt felt like swallowing air. By the time I reached the 10th floor, my hands were trembling uncontrollably. The hallway lights there flickered in a slow, rhythmic pattern, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. My apartment was at the far end of that corridor, but I noticed something else first. The elevator doors were open again, and this time there was no one, no figure inside. Yet the lights inside the car still glowed bright, an inexplicable power source illuminating the old metal walls. Stepping closer, I saw the elevator console was completely dark, no floor numbers lit, and no button pressed. I gripped the door frame to steady myself and peered in. The faint scent of damp metal and stale air made my stomach twist. Though my instincts screamed for me to shut the doors and ignore this impossible situation, my curiosity burned stronger than ever. Slowly, I edged my foot onto the elevator's threshold, half expecting the doors to snap shut and drag me away. Nothing happened. The cabin remained still, open, waiting. A voice in my mind echoed a warning I'd heard from neighbors, that ghosts might linger in places they once frequented, drawn to the routines they followed in life. My heart pounded mercilessly as I remembered how Mr. Oliveira had faithfully inspected this elevator every evening. Gathering every ounce of courage, I reached for the door close button. My hand trembled so badly that I kept missing the button, brushing only the cold metal panel. After a few fumbling tries, I managed to press it. The doors slid shut, leaving me alone on the 10th floor. My knees were on the verge of giving out, and I used the wall for support as I made my way to my apartment door. Inside, I locked every bolt, slid down to the floor, and tried to steady my breathing. My body shook from head to toe, and my mind raced. How could the elevator work with no power? What had I really seen? Hours later, when I finally managed some restless sleep, I dreamed of that silent gesture from the figure resembling Mr. Oliveira, his eyes dull yet fixed on me, compelling me to follow him into the unknown. In the following days, I avoided the elevator entirely. I went about my life with trembling hands and quickened pulses, always taking the stairs no matter how exhausted I felt. A few neighbors mentioned they had heard strange noises or seen flickering lights near the elevator late at night, but they offered only vague accounts. When they asked if I had noticed anything, I responded in half-truths, too uncertain to share my entire experience. Even now, every time I pass the elevator, I hesitate for a moment, recalling that inexplicable glow and the silent invitation. My heart pounds, my palms sweat, and I can't help picturing Mr. Oliveira standing there again, his expression caught between life and something far beyond. I don't know if it was a trick of my mind or a real manifestation of something unfinished, but I do know that each night, as I climb the stairs, I sense eyes on me from somewhere below. I remind myself over and over that I'm safe, that I'm imagining things. Yet the chill that wraps around my spine refuses to let me believe it. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear the faint sound of elevator doors sliding open on my floor, followed by an impossible hum of machinery. Each time, my chest tightens, and I curl into myself under the covers, refusing to check, because deep down, I suspect I would see that same figure waiting there, urging me to continue the journey he began. And I know with unsettling certainty that this place will never truly let me go. The air felt heavier the moment I crossed the threshold of my mother's creaking old porch. Nightfall clung to the windows like a threat, and the silence settling over those worn floorboards felt more oppressive than the stickiness of summer heat. I had no rational explanation for the prickling on my arms or the sense of 1,000 watchful eyes, but it stirred something deep and unnameable in me. I had come to help my teenage niece settle in for a few days with my mother, her grandmother, but something about that house, especially at night, always made me restless, and this time, the unease wasted no time sinking its claws into me. I remember the first evening clearly, a dull hum of cicadas outside, the old wooden clock in the hallway ticking a fraction too slow, and the stale odor of mothballs. My niece had brought up some boxes from the attic to show me family photographs. She carefully laid out images of my late father, a proud war veteran, his military medals pinned to crisp uniforms. A certain photo caught my attention. It showed him seated at this very kitchen table, staring intently at a letter. I felt my pulse quicken. My mother mentioned in a hushed tone that sometimes she still heard his measured footsteps pacing the corridor at odd hours. I could almost hear the phantom rhythm of boots on the hardwood. Something inside me tensed like a coiled spring. That night, after everyone had turned in, I found myself unable to sleep. My skin felt clammy, my throat dry. Each breath became shallow, as if the air were too thick to inhale. I wandered downstairs in search of water. The corridor was so dark that my hand shook as I fumbled for the light switch. Every creak under my feet made my heart pound faster, sending waves of cold sweat trickling down my back. When I reached the kitchen, my stomach knotted at the sight before me. Sitting at the table, hunched over a piece of paper, was a figure in a soldier's uniform. His posture was eerily rigid, and his attention seemed fixed on something he clutched in his gloved hands. I stood there, half blinded by the flickering overhead light, my feet locked to the floor, my limbs trembling with an intensity I'd never felt. My lungs refused to draw in a full breath, and my heart hammered so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest. For one suffocating moment, my brain insisted it was an intruder. Then something about the uniform, faded patches, the angle of the collar, reminded me of my father's old photographs. I tried to call out, but my voice cracked in my dry throat. The figure lifted its head slowly, as if sensing my presence. My entire body broke out in goosebumps. I blinked, and the kitchen was empty. At first, I considered it a vivid hallucination, maybe brought on by exhaustion, but as I stepped into the room, I noticed the chair had been dragged away from the table. That chair had been flush against the wall earlier. My pulse quickened again, and I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. I cautiously approached the table and froze. An old letter, yellowed around the edges, lay there. I knew all the letters my father had left behind, and none looked like this. My breathing grew shallow, a tightness clawing at my chest. I reached out, my fingers unsteady to pick it up. The paper's surface felt rough, and the ink had bled in places, as though it had been clutched in sweaty hands. I spent that night wide awake on the living room couch, heart hammering against my rib cage, every tick of the clock magnified. I couldn't dismiss what I'd seen, and the unsettling proof sat on the table, defying logic. In the morning, I found my mother in the kitchen, staring at the letter. Her expression told me she already suspected its origin. She mentioned, in her quiet way, that on some nights she heard boots striding across the hallway, and sometimes discovered windows open, even though she was sure she had locked them My niece, having overheard part of our hushed conversation, seemed uneasy, but tried to brush it off. I caught her gaze darting to every shadow in the corners of the room. Over the next few nights, the tension escalated. I felt a near constant dread coiled in the pit of my stomach. The floorboards groaned after midnight as though someone marched with regimented steps back and forth. Doors seemed to shift of their own accord, a faint push of air sending them ajar. My pulse became a drumbeat in my ears every time I ventured into a darkened corridor. I swore I felt a presence behind me when I washed my hands in the dimly lit bathroom. My reflection in the mirror revealed sweat-beaded temples, wide eyes flicking to the emptiness over my shoulder. There was never anyone there, at least no one living. One evening, a powerful thunderstorm rattled the windows. I felt the oppressive weight of the atmosphere settle on me like a leaden cloak. Lightning flashed, revealing fleeting shapes at the threshold of each doorway. My hands shook, breath catching in my throat, every hair on my arms standing on end. The rumble of thunder masked the sound of footsteps, but I sensed them nonetheless, in the stillness between each crash. My heart rate soared. I found myself struggling to keep panic from overwhelming me, as if any moment I would turn and see that uniformed figure looming in the dark. On the last night before I intended to leave, I forced myself to confront the kitchen again. My skin tingled with anxiety, and sweat dampened my collar. The smell of old wood and the flicker of a single light bulb overhead only heightened my awareness of every squeak, every subtle draft. The table stood where it always had, the chair pushed in. But I noticed the letter again on its surface, folded neatly this time. My throat felt like sandpaper. I reached out, feeling a tremor run through my arm. For a split second, I saw a reflection in the window, the silhouette of a soldier with haunted eyes. My heart pounded so violently, I thought I might collapse right there. Then a gust of wind rattled the glass, and the silhouette vanished. That was enough. Every nerve in me screamed to get away. I decided then and there to leave, taking my niece with me for the night, while my mother reassured us she'd be fine alone. She insisted she was used to the footsteps and the open windows, and she felt it was some strange manifestation of my father's unresolved spirit. I couldn't argue. My mind reeled with too many questions, and my hands trembled as I packed our things. Heading out the door, I glanced back. The house seemed to stare at me, as though it knew I was abandoning something I would never understand. Now, days later, my heart still races when I recall that silent figure at the table. My mouth goes dry, and I'm haunted by the memory of that letter's coarse texture beneath my fingertips. I can't shake the feeling that I left more behind in that house than just an explanation. I left a part of myself there, paralyzed by unseen forces, uncertain if my father's restless presence truly lingered, or if my own mind betrayed me. Sometimes, late at night, I see that faint reflection in my window, and my pulse pounds in my ears all over again. It's a reminder that some doors, once opened, never fully close.